In this video, we look at concepts that are central to the process of database design. We'll take a look at transactions and what they mean within a database. We'll understand concepts like entities, attributes, and relationships. We'll then consider a real-world example with an illustration of these concepts and look at how they fit together. Lastly, we'll look at unique identifiers and their importance within database design. Let's get started. A transaction can be thought of as the smallest unit of work that can be performed within a database. Examples of database transactions are create, read, update, delete. Database transactions are very different from a real-world business transaction. You can think of these as any action that is performed on the database. The whole point of a database is to store data meaningfully for a specific scenario or an environment. Concepts like entities, attributes, and relationships help us guide the design of how the data needs to be stored in a database. Let's take a real-world scenario and explore these concepts. Let's say you're the owner of a chain of restaurants. To make sense of your day-to-day operations, you'd like to build a database that can capture the business activity at these restaurants. Take a few seconds to think about the various things that exist within a restaurant environment. If you were the owner of multiple restaurants, what are the important things that you would want to capture data for? You'd want to store information about individual restaurants, the employees that work for each of these restaurants, customers who essentially visit these restaurants, and the items that are being ordered at these restaurants. This is a simple example of all the things that you would think of in a restaurant environment. You can think of these things as entities for which we'd like to store information. Next, let's take a look at attributes. Attributes are characteristics that describe entities. You can think of these as the type of data you'd want to store for each entity. In this scenario, customer name, address, and credit card info are some attributes that describe the customer. Likewise, name, position, and salary help describe the employee. And name, address, and cuisine may help in describing the restaurant entity. These are some examples of attributes for each of these entities. Next, let's understand relationships. Relationships represent the type of interaction that exists between two entities. A customer places an order. This is the relationship that exists between the customer and the restaurant entity. Whereas an employee works at the restaurant. The employee also prepares the order, and the food that is on the order is then served to the customer. These are some examples of relationships that exist within the entities within a restaurant environment. At a high level, concepts like entities, attributes, and relationships help us represent a real-world business transaction and thereby enable meaningful storage of information. Let's now look at unique identifiers and understand how they help us with our objective of storing information. A unique identifier is an attribute that identifies an entity. An ID is essential to distinguish between two entities of the same type. Let's consider the previous example of a restaurant and let's take the employee entity to understand the importance of a unique ID. Let's say we have two employees with the same first name and last name. At this point, it becomes very difficult for us to distinguish between John Wick, who's a manager, from John Wick, who's a chef. We need an attribute that can uniquely identify each of these employees. An employee ID attribute that is unique for each employee can help us solve this problem. John Wick, who is a manager, can be distinguished from John Wick, who is a chef, based on their employee IDs. Let's quickly summarize the key concepts that we looked at in this video. Entities are real-world objects or concepts about which you'd like to store information. Some examples we looked at are employee, restaurant, and customer within a restaurant environment. Relationships represent how two entities interact and share information with each other in the database. Couple of examples we looked at are an employee works at a restaurant, a customer orders food at the restaurant, etc. Attributes are properties or characteristics that describe entities. Employee name, employee position, employee phone number are some examples. A unique ID is an attribute that helps in uniquely identifying an entity. Employee ID, restaurant ID, and customer ID are some examples of unique identifiers. And with that, we can wrap up this lecture.